All right, so we're going to get started with the Educate panel. It is my honor to introduce our panel. It'll be moderated by Elizabeth Gregory. She is the director of the University of Houston Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Our panelists are Linda Cohn, the president of the League of Women Voters of the Houston area, Yvonne Frear, who is Behavioral and Social Sciences Department Chair and Liberal Arts Liaison to Dual Credit and Early College High Schools at San Jacinto College Central in Pasadena. She's also a distinguished faculty member there. It's a lot of words. Judge Phyllis Frye, the nation's first out transgender judge, and many, many other things. Kristen Contos Krueger, recently the launch and production manager for the ELCA National Youth Gathering that just completed, bringing 30,000 young people to the city of Houston this past summer, and they did it successfully. This is really pretty amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, our Educate panel.
Hello, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Gregory, and I'm really happy to be here moderating this excellent panel. And they asked me to make a few remarks initially, sort of about education, and then segue over to our panelists who will talk about their own education, personal, and the way they have been educating through their work. As we all know, whether we go to school or not, humans are always being educated, either formally or informally, just by living our lives. In our WGSS program, our motto is "Life is a Gender Studies course." And that's because every other news story lately is about gender, but it's also because we get lessons about gender right from day one, right when we're born. Somebody announces it's a boy or it's a girl, and then our parents react differently to that information, right? So right from the start, they begin training us on what it means to be a girl or a boy. So education is part of our being a human. It's like the programming, that we get some kind of hardware, and then the education is telling us how to use that. And as we all know, gender is basically a work assignment system. It tells people what they're supposed to do, what kinds of jobs they're supposed to do, and tells them their pay scale. So I'm including both unpaid and paid work in that use of the word work, because emotional work is work, care work is work, sex work is work, as well as all the other things we generally think of as a job. And these are all tasks that are necessary to the culture. And for millennia, the basic gender lesson women learned in many cultures was, do what you're told. And women have been told to be caregivers and servers, doing a lot of the essential work of reproduction of the culture for no pay. And due to their lack of education, formal education, and because their other work was never done, they had very little role in civic decision-making. So this culture didn't reflect very much of their input, at least in its formal mechanisms, though it did certainly in others. The culture as a whole suffers when we don't benefit from the insights of half the population, obviously. But that has been changing lately, due mostly to birth control, which began in a big way in the 19th century with the invention of vulcanized rubber. And you may not see a direct connection between birth control and education, but I'm here to propose that there is one. The birth rate in the US in 1800 was 7 kids per woman. In 1900, it was 3.5. So you see the big decline happened there in the 19th century. In 2000, it was 2.0. So women now have time to get the formal education before they have kids, and as a result, they are participating in the larger culture in new ways. And there are a lot of other factors in play, like, they live longer, they need fewer kids, things like that. But they've moved into civic world as voters and sometimes as public leaders, and into the business world as workers and sometimes as leaders. And as they've done so, gender lessons have been changing. Because we do different jobs, that means gender is changing, because as we know, gender is all about work. So that's where all these dynamics, these news stories are happening all the time. So women's studies courses and programs have played major roles in changing this discussion, I want to say, even for people who haven't gone to women's studies classes themselves. by challenging the legacy gender systems we've inherited, and by offering new analyses of how and why things have worked in the past and how they might work better going forward. Just by opening up the discussion and reminding the next generation, which they sort of know already, that they don't just have to accept the legacy systems. Just because they inherited them, they can rethink and revise them, and they need to. And the students in these classes are trying to figure out, how would a real democracy work? What if we didn't ground our economy on the free or unpaid labor of women, people of color, precarious immigrants, and the working class? What if we work to build, say, an economy of care? Other alternatives. Maybe where the chief product was happy people, instead of one based on exploitation and violence. Anyway, just an idea. So at UH, we get the additional benefit of Houston that just creates a classroom in which there are people from many cultures talking about the expectations of their different families and situations and how those do or do not make sense for them in conversation. And they understand that gender is one of many factors that underpins identity and experience, and that they all inform how we individually are received, and the analysis spreads outside of the classroom. So that's one way that education can formally intervene, by providing people with the tools for analysis, which they can then develop and refine, and then use to assist in their own agitating and advocating. So educating the community about new possibilities for equity and mutual support. So our panelists all make interventions in our community to educate and open up perspectives, and this is what they've been dedicating their lives to. And I'm going to ask each one of them, as we've been asked to do, to talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for some more questions and discussion with the audience. So as everyone's bios are in the program, so please review those, and join me in welcoming our panel. And Linda Cohn, would you like to begin?
Very good. I'm Linda Cohn. I'm presently serving a term as president of the League of Women Voters of the Houston area. The League of Women Voters is a direct descendant of the Harris County Equal Suffrage Association. When the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote back in 1920, the organization did not disband. It simply rebooted as a vehicle to help educate all voters, men and women together. So here we are in the thick of an election season, and I can tell you that we are preparing the 98th edition of our fabled Voter's Guide to the Election and the Candidates. Talk about an instrument for education. We go out and we ask candidates, and there are over 200 of them for Harris County. We ask these candidates to provide an autobiographical sketch, and then we ask them for their responses to selected policy questions. And we reproduce this exactly as it is submitted to us. Candidates are character limited, but we do not correct spelling, we do not correct grammar. It comes directly from the candidate to you, the voter, so you can compare candidates side by side and figure out which candidate's views most closely align with yours. So that's a pretty big educational, voter education function. But really, I'd like to riff off something that Elizabeth mentioned earlier, which is that life is education. I think that we are all entitled to use our life experiences to make sense of this world and to decide how we want to move forward, where we stand on issues, where we stand on matters of public deportment, even. And this is a day for personal stories. So I'm going to pluck one from my family tree and tell you the story about my grandpa, Dave. He arrived in the port of Boston in the early morning of April 21st, 1921, a man from Bremenhaven in Germany. He was young, he was handsome, He was full of hope and promise, and he was totally illegal. It wasn't that he was without papers, it was just that the papers happened to belong to someone else. But he wanted to come to America, and this is how he got here. Eventually, he straightened out his status, and he became a citizen in 1930. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Nazi era had taken hold, and Dave, Grandpa Dave, who was a Jewish man, lost his entire family to the Holocaust. His mother, his father, 4 brothers, 3 sisters, dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins, all dead. But Dave lived. He was an American, and so he lived. And he lived to become the father of 3, grandfather to 7, and great-grandfather to 10, 3 of whom proudly carry his name. And the thing that I want you to know is about Grandpa Dave was that on every election day, he went to the polls and he voted. And sometimes he wept. And that made a bigger impression on me than any book learning I ever could have read about, anything a teacher could have related. It was part of our life story, part of our family story. And we mentioned about, talking earlier about women and men and education. It used to be, and this was meant as a compliment. We wouldn't take it that way now, but this was meant as a compliment, speaking in favor of education for women. The saying was, when you educate a man, you educate an individual. When you educate a woman, you educate a family. I think both men and women together, when each goes to school, reads a newspaper, participates in a conference such as this, participates in any way in public life, that's a form of education, and it's a wonderful legacy to leave to our children.
Thank you, Linda. Dr. Frear?
Good morning again. So, sitting on this panel with my other very well-known and very vetted and responsible speakers, I asked myself, why am I here? And after speaking with a few of the board members with the Houston History Alliance, I recalled that I was asked to talk about, just briefly, my involvement with my current social organization, but definitely very politically motivated. Don't ring the bell. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And it is that organization many years ago, as a much younger girl, that introduced me to the impact of educated women in an organized structure, if you will. I can remember being in junior high, for those of you who are a little bit younger, that would be middle school now, and meeting a wonderful counselor, Linda Cohn, who saw something in me as a very young academic. I loved books. I wanted to make straight A's all the time because the option of anything else wasn't allowed in my household. I was being reared by my grandmother, 2 older sisters, and my mother. And so all I knew is that you made straight A's, you studied, because that's what was expected. But Linda Cohn, who I would later come to find out was a very active member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the Houston alumni chapter, sought out to say that you can do more. What do you want to do in your life? And like many students attending at the time Cullen Junior High School on Scott Street, well, I want to do something special. I can be a doctor. I can be a lawyer. I gave the expected answer. And she said, but what are you going to do for the community? And I'm like, community? I come to school. And she said, well, I want you to become involved in some additional groups. And one of those was the Delta Sigma Theta Student Development Group. And they had an organization or meetings for young kids, males as well as females. They met at the University of Houston, across the street on Calhoun. Now, keep in mind, I had never known where University of Houston was, hadn't stepped foot there. College was definitely a part of the conversation in my household. My grandmother, who had a 6th grade education, but was very literate, definitely a part of our political climate in our local community of South Union. You're going to college. I don't know where, I don't know how, but you make straight A's, you enter into college. That was the narrative that I grew up with. Well, Nell Cole, as a member of Delta Sigma Theta, said you have to do more. And so by being a part of this student development group with Delta Sigma Theta, I was exposed to young ladies who were now in college. They were making good grades. They were taking 18 hours. I had no idea what that looked like. You go to class 18 hours a day. It's only 24 hours in a day. So what does that look like? In high school, I would be further, I guess, nurtured by still Nell Cole. She would check in periodically with counselors at Jack Yates Senior High School in Houston, Texas, where I would be one of the introductory students in the School of Communications that is still there, very prominent, but still asking a question. You need to be involved. You have to be a part of the community structure. And so at that time, I started attending more and more of the civic club meetings in South Union. I worked under Zolly Scales. From that, Zolly Scales says, well, you need to go to University of Houston, and you definitely need to meet with a Dr. Richard Murray. Some of you remember or do know Dr. Richard Murray. And so I became a political science major. Still, this particular organization wasn't a part of my life in the terms of me pledging. Nope, didn't immediately pledge, didn't even know what that looked like, because I was still under the tutelage of you will go to college, you will graduate in 4 years, and you will buy new furniture for the household, because that's what you're supposed to do to be responsible. And so I went to college. I went to University of Houston. I majored in political science with a minor in history and English, still knowing but not knowing what that would look like, how that education would propel me into positions today where I'm still being educated. I see education as being fluid, as being formal, semi-formal, as well as informal in conversations. Currently in my particular organization, I am now a member of Delta Sigma Theta, Sorority Incorporated. We have a new mantra of be in the picture, be a part of the conversation. What that means is that I had to go to persons like Judge Frye and persons like Ms. Cohen and others to help nurture me more to know how to apply for graduate school, to get into a Texas A&M University PhD program in history, gig 'em, and to be able to navigate how to become a historian. What does it actually mean to study? What does it mean when I'm reading books? To want to appropriate the story about your father into my lessons, because, as I teach. Because we talk about the diary of Anne Frank, but now I get to say, I have a friend whose father was an immigrant, and he was illegal. Not the illegal that you think about, but this different illegal. That's education. And this is what many of our students need to know. But all of that came under those seeds that were planted by Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and so many others. And so maybe throughout the conversation this afternoon, you'll learn more. Thank you.
Agitate, educate, and advocate. I could sit on any of those three panels, but I'm going to be on the education panel. So let me tell you a few things that I have, and you might want to get out a pen and something to write on, because I'm going to give you a few things to look up. That's your homework assignment. The first thing is I brought several flash drives that hold about 3,500 pages and pictures of stuff that I've either written or has been written about me as a trans person during the last 40 years. And so if you are an educator or a journalist or somebody who wants a copy of that, I'll be glad to give it to you with one proviso. You can't go home and stick it someplace and not look at it, because I've bought several hundred of these at $5 a pop, and I'm just not interested in throwing that money away. But if you promise either to post it on your school's website or to go to Office Max or Office Depot or someplace like that and get some thumb drives and make copies and share it with your friends whenever you talk about transgender issues or anything of that sort, then you can have a copy. Okay. I really had to educate myself first because I was born in San Antonio, and I was taught to look down at people of color. I was taught to look down at anybody who's any religion other than Protestant. I was taught white male privilege, and that's the way I lived because that's the way I was taught. And I knew I wanted to be a girl since the time I was about 5 years old, but there was so much social pressure back then, as Professor Gregory alluded to. When you're born, you're pronounced one or the other, and you're taught the social skills that go with that. And if you try to do other social skills, it ain't going to work. And you are at first lightly admonished, and then a little bit more severely corrected. And you want your parents' love, and you want your aunts and uncles and other people's love and attention, so you conform. And so I conformed. I conformed very well. I am an Eagle Boy Scout. In high school, I was the ROTC commander. At Texas A&M, I wore senior boots in the Corps of Cadets. I am a military veteran, and I did all these things before the age of 28. And the reason why I say that is not because of the greater glorification of Phyllis Frye, but to let you know that I didn't become Phyllis because I couldn't cut it as a guy. I was really good at that. I became Phyllis because that's who I am, and that's who I've always been. And it was about that time that I met and married my second wife, who doesn't want her name mentioned, doesn't want me to point to her, but she is here with me. We had our 45th anniversary recently. You can clap to that one. And I found out real quick about the second-class nature of being a woman in our society in the 70s. And I learned a lot about being discriminated against. And I met people of color, and I met people of other religions, and I began to educate myself. There was another thing that was going on at the time, and that was there was a law in the city of Houston that made transgender people, as well as lesbians in gay bars, as well as gay men who cross-dressed in and did female impersonation in the gay bars, subject to arrest. So every day that I went out of the house to look for a job because I'd been blackballed from engineering, 2 engineering degrees, an engineering license, and I couldn't get work in the city of Houston as a trans woman, wasn't going to happen. Wasn't going to happen. And I went out to lobby against the ordinance to try to get rid of the ordinance that made me subject to arrest. Now, our sole and only income was her income as a school teacher. She didn't make much that time. And she was terrified that they were going to find out where she taught about me, and she was going to lose her job. And she was under pressure from her family, and my family had disowned me, and the neighbors were just awful. The neighbors were just awful. Well, I couldn't get a job, and I was lobbying to get rid of the ordinance, and I decided I'm going to go back to college and use my GI Bill and get a master's in business administration, because I knew that I would be in class with engineering managers and other people. They might get to meet me, they might get to know me, they might see the stereotypes didn't work, and I might get offered a job. So I went to the University of Houston, and I applied, and I found out that they had a joint degree program where if you applied to both and were accepted at both, you could get a joint degree in business and a joint degree in law. And that would put me in school for 4 years instead of a year and a half, which means I got the GI Bill for 4 years instead of a year and a half, and that was income. And besides that, I figured if I was a lawyer, maybe the neighbors would finally become afraid of me and leave us alone. And that's what happened, and that's the only reason I became a lawyer. I met Nikki Van Hightower when she was the women's advocate. She's going to be in the next panel. And I was asking her about getting rid of the ordinance, and she told me, she introduced me to a lot of activist women, as well as women I met when I joined the League of Women Voters, and I became very active in all of the stuff that was going on in the late 70s and the early 80s. And I became involved in the now LGBT, but then gay political caucus. I met Anise. I met a lot of different people. Anise got me involved in a lesbian softball league because she was the coach. And that was really a lot of fun. But the main thing that I did after that was in 1991, it became painfully obvious to me that any national, state, or local LGB organization was not inclusive of T, not even the local then gay and lesbian political caucus. And we were on our own. And it really ticked me off. And since somebody previously used the word pissed off, I will too. And so I formed a group called the International Conference for Transgender Law and Employment Policy. On that flash drive, you'll find the proceedings, transcripted proceedings from 5 of those conferences. And I trained all of the transgender advocates who went out nationally during those 5 years. And they trained, and they trained, and other people trained. And so now, at the age of 70, I don't have to go out and agitate like I used to. I don't have to go out and advocate like I used to, although I still will, and I still do. But I don't have to do what I used to because the trans bloggers and the trans activists and the trans lobbyists and the people that are running for office as open transgender people around the country today, those are all 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th generation of people that I trained and I educated, just like I'm educating you today. So it's been an exciting life. It's been a fulfilling life. Anise appointed me as being a judge. I'm entering my 9th year. I'm an associate judge, which means part-time, for the city of Houston. I chose to be a part-time judge so I could continue to practice law. And I have a 6-person law firm here in town, and we do just about everything. But what I'm most proud of is the fact that 5 of the people in our 6-person law firm are women. And we have 2 African Americans, 1 Hispanic, 3 Caucasians. 4 of the people in our law firm are straight. And the 2 partners, including me, are queer. And they know it, and they know most of our clients, not all of our clients, but most of our clients are LGBT, or they're supportive straight people. And the 4 straight lawyers in our firm, they buy into that. They think that's terrific. So it's really a neat gig. What I do now at the age of 70, I go into my law office maybe 1 or 2 afternoons a week, check on things, mentor some of the other lawyers, answer a question. I go out and network like crazy for the firm. I sit on the bench 1 or 2 nights a month. I get to marry people. That's fun. I get to marry people as a judge. But most of the time, I'm at home. I work out. Good, I've got a minute left. I work out 3 or 4 mornings a week, 2.5 hours. During the last several years, I lost 75 pounds because I wasn't healthy with the weight I was carrying. I was very pre-diabetic, and I lost that weight, 3 pounds a month, over 3 years. My wife recently retired from teaching children for 52 years. And we are enjoying ourselves. But when it's time to kick a little butt, I do it. When it's time to go someplace that people don't want me to be, I'm there. And so, you know, it's great. I encourage all of you to come out. And I don't mean to come out as being LGBTQ, unless you are LGBTQ, but to come out as an active supporter. You know, it's my belief that if every LGBTQ plus person in the United States all came out of the closet, there's just not enough of us. We are not a majority. And we as the LGBTQ community, we can't constantly expect people to support us if we aren't willing to support other people. So, my message to you today is this. If you truly believe in inclusivity, and if you truly believe in diversity, it doesn't matter who you are. The next time you're with friends, or family, or at Thanksgiving meal, or a social gathering, or a coworker, and somebody says something ugly about a Jew, well, I'll let it pass. I'm not Jewish. Or about a Muslim. Well, I don't want to get into it. I'm not a Muslim. Or about a black, or a Hispanic, or a gay person, or somebody in a derogatory fashion, and guess what? You're not one of those people. Well, you're going to have to stand up. You got to come out of the closet, gang. You've got to say, no, that's wrong, and I'm not going to put up with it. And until everybody stands up for the other person, we're going to keep putting up with this garbage that has really become prevalent. I didn't say a name. I didn't say a political party. I didn't. But you've got to stand up. You've got to get the backbone to stand up and say, no, that's wrong. I'm not going to listen to it. So that's my message to you.
I think mine does work. Okay, so I'm a history professor, and what that means is that I love stories. So I'm going to tell you some. This summer, I had the privilege of being a part of bringing 32,000 people to the city of Houston. 30,000 of them were young people. They were high school students, and they came to the city to serve. I can't really tell you what 32,000 people looks like. And when they invited me to do that, I couldn't really picture how we were going to actually, in the course of 3 days, put 32,000 people on buses and send them to work at every nonprofit in the city that could take a bus full of 50 students to do some kind of meaningful work. And that part I knew we could figure out, right? I mean, that's a phenomenal thing. But the bigger question was, so what, right? Like they go, they spend a few hours, they move a garden, they plant things, they paint a mural. I mean, you name it, they did it. But what's really concerning to me is what happens when they go home, right? So they've had these amazing 3 days, but that's not enough. And so we shaped their time through the power of story. And I think that's the part I want to tell you about today, because it's the part I think we can do in every part of our lives. So what we did is we asked the students before they came to collect books. And we worked with educators across the city of Houston to create this list of books that included stories of kids of every color, that included stories of rich kids and poor kids and black kids and Latino kids, and books that were written in Spanish, and books about children who were Muslim, and books about children with different kinds of abilities, and books for kids who were just learning to read but maybe weren't kindergartners, and books that represented families that didn't look like a mom and a dad in a house with a dog. Right? We looked very carefully at what those books could look like, both in making sure that they were representative and making sure that they were actually books that were appealing to kids so they might want to read them, right? Because sometimes we as adults are really good at picking books that we think kids should like because they have a great message, but that doesn't mean children want to read them. So we created this amazing list, and we sent it out to all of the churches that were sending their kids to come. And they collected books, and we had no idea what that was going to look like, how many books we were going to get. It was a gamble. But they came, and they brought 40,000 books with them. And those books came, and we could have stopped there, right? Like 40,000 books is an amazing gift to the city. But that wouldn't have been enough. So instead, we harnessed this power of story. And when the students arrived, they brought their books, and they put them in these massive piles. And then we brought them to the NRG, and we filled up all of Hall A, and they came to NRG, and they learned about literacy. They learned about how important it is for kids in Houston and everywhere to have access to books in their home, and how so many kids don't have that, and why literacy matters, and how important it is that kids see themselves represented in books, their neighbors represented in books, but also kids who look nothing like them, and how when they have just the connection to the outside world through books, it changes the way they look. And then they heard from all the partners who were going to be receiving these books. They heard from the YMCAs, they heard from the HISD schools in neighborhoods of kids whose families can't afford to bring them books home. And they heard from a pastor whose church runs a community library where people from the whole neighborhood can come and take books home for their families, and sometimes they bring them back and sometimes they don't, but that's not really the point. The point is to bring the books into the families' homes, except for that church was flooded in Harvey, and they lost all their books. And the students heard that story, and they heard why it mattered to rebuild that. And then they spent a few hours of their time packing those books up and creating mobile book fairs. And then we put those books on buses with other kids, and those other kids took those books out into the community, and in 40 sites across the city of Houston over 2 days, kids took those books home, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 books, depending on the site and how many kids showed up at that day. And those kids walked home with 3 books that they would have never had in their houses before. And then those kids that came to Houston went home. And you know what they're doing? We're hearing these stories now that at home, these church groups are collecting books and finding literacy organizations in schools and libraries they can work with. And they're doing this again because they learned why it mattered and they made it theirs. And I think that's the important part about the power of story, that it's not just about telling our stories, right? And I certainly hope everybody does. I think everybody in this room has a story to tell, and that it's a story that matters. But if we just tell our stories, we haven't done the work, right? The work starts there. It starts at telling the authentic story about why this matters, whatever it is, right? And then it's inviting people into the work. It's the part where the students pack the boxes and go to the book fairs, right? And doing the work together. And then it's the part of saying, now you know the work, you know the story, you know how to do it, make it yours, right? How do you make this cause into something else? And we're seeing that these students are doing that because they were taught how, right? And that part is super important. And then here's the outcome, right? Because I have this other job of my life where I have these 2 children who are amazing little girls. And they are gifted these books. My mother and my sister-in-laws every year for Christmas gift my daughters with books about strong, independent women. And so from the time that they could sit on my lap and read, and even before that they got to listen to the books I was reading for my dissertation. But as soon as they had an opinion, so who knows what they observed out of that. But from the time they could pick, they've been hearing the stories of little girls who's desegregated schools, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and right, they've been hearing these stories of women who changed the world, right? And as a result from that, they pay attention differently. Now, my 7-year-old is a really special kid in a lot of different ways, and she has an amazing story of her own. But I want to tell you one chorus story because I think that her story is part of this bigger picture of why story matters, right? She's grown up on these stories. She's heard her whole life about how girls and women can change the world. So one day I was cooking dinner and she came running into the kitchen, just indignant as all of her could be, right? All 6 years of her, just mad as could be because PBS Kids was wrong. I was like, okay, you're watching PBS because typically, right, they show things that are, safe for kids to watch. And this isn't I'm very confused in this situation. Mom, the Cat in the Hat is not fair. They are not doing things right. And it took her a long time to get all the words out. She was so mad. And my kid has a lot of words, so that she was, very emotional about this. Finally, she calmed down enough to explain to me that she was watching The Cat in the Hat knows a lot about that, and they were being mean to girls. Now, I have seen this show a lot, and I was still really confused. But for those of you who don't actually live with 6-year-olds, the way this show works, right, is that the Cat in the Hat, right, Dr. Seuss's Cat in the Hat, shows up in the backyard of these 2 neighbors, Nick and Sally, and they go off on an adventure and learn about different parts of nature and the world. And they learn a lot of science, and right, this is a very cute show where kids learn things, and I still couldn't figure out why my kid was mad. Well, there's one segment in the show where the Nick and Sally characters take turns taking pictures, and they take a picture of an object really close up, and then the kids in the TV audience are supposed to guess, what is this a picture of? And that's the part that had my kids so worked up. So after I calmed her down, she decided that the right thing to do was to write a letter to PBS Kids. So this is what Cora wrote. She says, "Dear PBS, I don't think the Cat in the Hat shows respect, because every time Nick takes a picture, Sally says, 'Great photo, Nick.' But every time Sally takes a picture, Nick says, 'Next time, I get to take the picture.' Just because she's a girl doesn't mean she doesn't deserve fairness." So I put a stamp on it and I mailed it, and I honestly thought that was the end of the story, right? But it wasn't. And this is where it matters, because PBS Kids wrote her back. And they didn't send her a form letter. They took the time to write her a personal letter. It was a page-long, single-space letter that they wrote to her that she has framed on her wall. And they acknowledged their mistake. They told her she was right. Right? They said, we think you're talking about this segment, and we rewatched it, and we can see your concern. And what we have done is we have passed your letter and your thoughts on to the writers of the show. We think you will see an improvement in the next season. And we encourage you, anytime you see injustice, to keep speaking up. Right? Think about what that meant for my kid. It means that my kid now, at 7, will tell anybody who she ever meets. and I do mean anybody, so if you ever meet my kid, you'll hear the story. But she'll tell them, I know I can change the world. I already changed PBS, right? Like, this isn't a big deal at all for her. But she can do that because of the power of story, right? Because her whole life has been shaped by this authentic story of how people could change the world. She didn't question that she could do this. And the fact that she was shaped that way, and then PBS responded by making it hers, right? It takes both steps. Really, it's 3 steps, right? Those steps of telling an authentic story, acting out on that story, and then passing that story on and making it yours. And so if I were to imagine any way to educate young people, it would be that, to use those 3 steps of telling authentic, meaningful stories.
Thank you all. Is this audible? Okay, good. I was asked to start off the questions with a question for each of the panelists and then go to the questions from the audience, so if that's okay. Linda, you referenced that this was the 98th League summary, Voters Guide. And I wonder, given that that means we're 2 years from the centenary, what are you planning to do to celebrate? And also, do you think 100 years is a long time or a short time?
100 years is barely a tick on the national timeline. I want you to know that my mother, who is still alive, was born into an America where women did not have the right to vote. One little tick on our family, we're hearing a lot about my family today. One little tick on the national timeline, on our family's timeline, separates them from an indignity that our children cannot even imagine. Change is possible. Yeah, we are planning to celebrate. We already did a little bit of celebrating here in Texas because in 2018, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of women voting in Texas primaries. It was a baby step. It was a little step. And a big shout out to Hortense Sparks Ward, who was the first woman to register to vote in Harris County.
Okay, excellent. Does everybody know that you could, Democratic women, well, basically voted, that was who, women could vote in the primaries, right?
Indeed, they could vote in the primary election. But I want to tell you something else about Hortense, who is my personal hero. She was the first woman to register to vote. And she was asked after she filled out that bit of paperwork, are you going to run to be a delegate to the Democratic Convention? Hortense was an attorney, an activist, had testified before the legislature in Austin in support of women's issues. And she said, no, why would I do that? There are men who are perfectly qualified. I'm not going to do that. We human beings are very complicated creatures.
Maybe she could see that there might be some.
And you know, she,
discomfort.
as an attorney, she would not argue in court because she was afraid that her presence as a woman would disadvantage her clients. So she never argued in court. She sat as a judge at one time. You all know the story of the Woodmen of the World? You don't? Okay. There was a case, property litigation, against a fraternal organization called Woodmen of the World. Woodmen of the World just happened to have been the fraternal organization that provided life insurance for every single judge in Texas. No judge could hear the case. They were all guys. They were all insured by Woodmen of the World. Governor of Texas found 3 ladies, one of them was Hortense Sparks Ward, to serve as special judges to hear the case. So you had a 3-judge special panel hearing this case. Only time that's happened before or since, all female court.
And why was the insurance company called Women of the World?
Well, it was a fraternal organization, and one of the benefits they provided was life insurance.
Why
For
did
judges.
Why
For
did they
judges.
have that title?
I don't know why it was called that. I do not know. I will have to check the history books. Woodmen, yeah.
Oh,
They-
Woodmen of the
yeah.
World. I thought she
And-
was saying it was Women of the World.
Oh, no, not women.
Pardon me.
Failed again by my New York accent.
It sounded like that would be an interesting story if it were in fact called that.
That would have been an even better story. I think the story is good as it stands.
Dr. Frear, the New York Times had a headline this week that the lessons of the past are pushing Southern black women to lead a revolution in the present. Did you see that story?
I did not see that story, but I did hear about it.
So they were focusing on women using their networks, which, quote, forged in segregation to bring out the vote, including churches, neighborhoods, possibly sororities, and, you know, lots of different groups. But they might also speak to the pain of the past, pushing women to make change as well, not as well as the organization. What is your take on black women's roles as leaders of change today, and how does that connect to the past? Maybe just a few thoughts.
My thoughts on black women and definitely making some transformative steps in change is that we are taking much control over our own lives. I think the narrative, or I should say, I know the narrative have changed from being victims, being invisible, to definitely positioning ourselves as agents and not just working at the grassroots level, but definitely heading up organizations, heading up causes like the Black Lives Movement, being a part of the conversation, whether it's with Me Too, working in, no affiliations, but political organizations across party lines. And so black women are no longer sitting passively by, accepting the more stoic roles of just being unheard or being domesticated. Nothing wrong with being domesticated. Those of you who appreciate that, I think in some form we all are, men as well as women. But this activeness, this agency that has come through education, again, formal, semi-formal, and informal, has projected many of these women into positions of power and now being heard across all party lines in education and entertainment, politics, and many different industries.
So they have a different platform.
They definitely have a different platform, and a platform that is global even, that's global. It's no longer just a statewide or even national movement, but this is a global conversation that's definitely a part of it. Some people may have tried to attribute it all to Oprah Winfrey, but understand she may be a great catalyst that has ignited the fire under many women, even in her particular circles, to become active. But I think that it has had a trickle-down effect to those lesser known women, or women who didn't think that they had a voice or could impact and affect change. I mean, women like myself, being a part of literacy movements, supporting issues of political control, supporting mentoring of students so that they can be educated, and now helping out with social justice, learning what equity means across the lines.
Just part of the community component that you were talking about.
Exactly,
from the very
exactly.
beginning. Judge Frye, some people, I have a couple of questions, so I'm trying to pick which one.
Hold on just a second.
Yes.
Is my mic on?
Yes.
Okay, I got it just before.
Okay.
I told everybody to get out their pen and paper. I was going to give them something to write down. I forgot.
Oh, okay.
Write down the International Bill of Gender Rights. Go to your Wikipedia, International Bill of Gender Rights. That came out of the law conference that I put together in the 90s. There's 10 of them. It took us 4 years to put it together. It's not the International Bill of Transgender Rights. It's the International Bill of Gender Rights. You will be amazed at what we came up with, and a lot of NGOs have adopted quite a bit of it. That's the first thing. Second thing, Google New York Times, Phyllis Frye. Because in August of 2015, they did a story about me that was on the front page above the fold of a Sunday edition of the New York Times. Blew me away. The third thing, and then your story about the jury, about Ms. Ward and not going in front of a jury because she didn't want to jeopardize her clients. I did trial work for about 20 years of my legal career. And I always made sure, even though I passed really well, I always made sure that the Venari panel knew, because I told them, that I was transgendered as part of the voir dire. Because towards the end of the voir dire, I would go through and I would ask each one, is the fact that Mr. or Ms. So-and-so's attorney is now a transgender person, is that going to cause you blah, And I can't tell you how many people raised their hand and said that was going to be a problem. And that's an automatic strike. I didn't have to spend any of my freebie peremptory strikes. I got rid of all the conservatives in all of my jury panels. Okay.
Good strategy. Some people seem to have a very clear idea that they are the opposite gender, which might seem to reaffirm standard genders, but there also seems to be an element of questioning of gender fixity overall introduced. And is that your sense, or how do you think these two lessons interact in the wider discussion of gender today?
I have no idea. It's personal. It's very personal. I think of all the things that a person does in this life, announcing to the world that the gender they were assigned at birth just isn't the right one, and actually coming out is one of the most terrifying things you can do. Now, some people say, well, a lot of people come out as being lesbian or gay, and that's true, and that's also terrifying. But if you're an out lesbian or out gay male, unless you really do go to extremes in expressing the stereotype, you can pick and choose who you come out to. But believe me, if you change gender wholesale, you can't pick and choose your family member, your coworker, your next door neighbor, or whatever. The garbage that we got when I went full-time in 1976 from our neighbors, we got our house vandalized, we got tires slashed. Guess when we got the obscene phone calls? 2 times each year. Guess? Come on, somebody. Easter and Christmas. That's when we got the obscene phone calls. And every Halloween, in the morning before we put the dogs out, we would patrol the backyard to make sure that some mean person hadn't put any poison out. And I remember one year, you remember when we had the straight slate back in the 90s? That big backlash against the gay rights ordinance that went up for election and lost. There were some people in our neighborhood that they had straight slate signs surrounding our house. And one of my dogs died of old age. And we were poor. I couldn't afford to take it to the vet and have it cremated, so we buried it in the backyard. And I asked my neighbor, would you please watch me bury this dog? And he says, well, yeah. I said, you don't understand. Well, no. And I said, because if a kid disappears, they're going to dig up our backyard. And I need somebody to see what I put in that hole. Oh, yeah. It's scary. Even in 2018, it's scary to come out if you're transgendered. It just is. But I am a role model, and I can tell you, if I could do it in the mid-70s, what's your problem?
Excellent. Thank you. Kristen, the girls' studies movement is growing. Do you think we should be teaching gender studies in middle school? Or how do you think the education of girls is changing formally? Because you were sort of talking about informal issues, but what about the formal education of girls, and what do you think how should it change, if at all?
No, I think we should be teaching that to elementary school students. I mean, I don't think that's a middle school topic. I think that children, from the time they go to school, should learn that gender matters in the same way that they learn that other parts of their identity matter. I told you I'd tell you a lot of stories about my kid. She spent an entire unit learning about inventors last year in first grade. They were all men and only one was black. The rest of them were white men. You better believe that the next day she brought all her books to school to show her teacher that women could invent things too. And that wasn't my idea, right? But I think that, yes, our formal education system needs to include the stories of men and women and people of color and people with different abilities and different sexualities, because that's the actual story. And so when I get to teach in my kids' classroom, that's absolutely how we teach it. And she's had some teachers who do that. And when I teach my college students, they're back there, they could tell you that's absolutely how we engage these questions in our class too, is that we make sure that all of those voices are heard.
Thank you. Okay, so people from the audience have questions for, do you want to go to the mic, or do you want to just shout?
This is for you on the end of the League of Women Voters. Everyone talks about women having fear. But there's also talking a lot about...
We can't hear you.
We're actually videotaping all of the sessions, and they're going to be available on our website. So please do use the microphones when you're asking questions so you can be part of the video.
My question was about the League of Women Voters and your role, but there are tons of women running this year in particular. There's a lot of coverage about it. Is there particular advice, nonpartisan, that the League of Women Voters would give to women candidates?
Yes, just run. If you think, if this is what you are called to do, do it. And I can't go further than that, because otherwise I'd be endorsing or opposing a candidate. And certainly, there are men who have advocated for women in a way that's totally commendable. And we are grateful. We could not, I don't think any group that had to fight for basic civil rights could have done it alone. You rely on allies, you rely on collaborations, you rely on the justice and rectitude of your cause. It was true for women. Phyllis, would you say that's true for GLBT?
Absolutely. You just got to run. A lot of times when I'm at transgender events and they ask me a similar question, I said, it's time for y'all to run. So what if you don't get elected? You're going to meet people. They're going to meet you. They're going to learn about us. You're going to get experience. You're going to, you know, Mayor Parker did not win her first election. She won her second election, and she won all of her elections after that. You got to run. You got to vote.
You got to be part of the conversation.
Yes. Okay, go ahead. Oh, somebody was standing up. I thought they were at the mic. If you're going to ask a question, you need to get in front of the mic now. We're running out of time.
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
This is for Kristen. Kristen, could you please share with us how we can get that list of the books?
Sure.
Thank you.
I have to borrow somebody's mic, though. Thanks. So the event that I was a part of was called the ELCA, that's the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Youth Gathering. So if you go to the ELCA Youth Gathering website and search for Blast Off for Books, which is what we called that campaign, then you'll find that list of books. So it's the ELCA Youth Gathering, and then Blast Off for Books.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to our panel.